The government now engages in massive secret surveillance programs that intrude into every facet of our lives. A common element of most predatory prosecutions is the classified surveillance of targets. The government, this is a toy that the government just cannot get away from using, and they just love this thing. The Inspector General of the Justice Department has found out that the government cannot identify exculpatory information obtained from these secret surveillance programs as required by law. The government can cherry-pick the information to find evidence that shows that you might be guilty of material support for terrorism. But it cannot identify information that would show that you are not guilty of material support. The unfairness of this is obvious, and this is why it was singled out by the Inspector General as something that required a change. The Inspector General has recommended that all terrorist convictions should be reviewed, presumably by special prosecutors, some such mechanism, in order to dismiss charges against those who are not given required exculpatory information. Since the charges are usually phony or contrived, a review would probably result in the dismissal of most cases. Congress should adopt the recommendation of the Inspector General and review the predatory prosecution cases. The 9/11 attackers had fear as their main weapon. By themselves, they could not make us regard Islam as the enemy. They could not force us to impose a collective guilt on Muslim Americans. But they clearly hoped that their attack would have this effect on us. They could not make us abandon the constitutional principle of equal protection of the laws. Only our own fear could make us do that. Now, almost a decade after 9/11, it is time that we Americans stop feeling terrified about what a small group of people might be able to do to us. It is fear that is dividing our country and destroying our freedoms. We must stop predatory prosecution using thought crimes and manufactured charges against its own citizens. The Justice Department should appoint special prosecutors to review and repair the damage already done, and we must return to a constitutional form of government in which all persons are treated equally before the law. It is our best protection against those who would do harm to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Downs.
Be to either Professor Aziz or Attorney Downs. But I'm wondering about if it is possible, both politically and legally, to challenge the very political concept of terrorism. That sometimes we can be very much on the defensive to say that someone has no connection, nor did anyone in their family have any connection to an elected government or a very broad social movement for change in another country. If that grouping has been labeled terrorist. And that in itself is a very political, it seems, connotation. The unelected government in Egypt is not terrorist, but the elected Palestinian government in Gaza or Lebanon is terrorist. So these become political constructs themselves, and then any connection does not. And just to take it from the other side, because the very term terrorism is so political that you have a situation where the right wing in this country can use targeted signs, go to political rallies with guns, talk about who should be in the crosshairs, and then actually have someone carry out an act of mass murder, and we're told this is not terrorism, this is simply a lone deranged individual. So the very concept of terrorism, I want to ask about being challenged at the same time challenging the idea that any connection, which in terms of freedom of speech, freedom of association, or the thought crime prosecution, is also political.
I think that the term terrorism is probably the most overly abused term there is. It is essentially useless. It's essentially meaningless, except that it has a tremendous power and can be used to manipulate public opinion. George Washington would have been a terrorist, was a terrorist to the British. Depends on which side of it you look at. At the same time, it astonishes me that the Ku Klux Klan, can have a military base just outside of Washington, D.C., where they train people on using of arms, and they can indoctrinate people ideologically, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's protected free speech and the Second Amendment. They are not terrorists. Who knew, you know? It's classic political problem in which you label somebody so that you don't have to listen to them. If you can label a group as terrorist, it means they are outside of the pale. They're outside of political discussion, and we don't have to try to listen to what they want. Because people don't go around just blowing up other people for no reason. All of these groups that have been labeled terrorist are labeled terrorists because they're involved in conflict somewhere in the world. And they have a point they're trying to make. They may want freedom. They may want to control their resources. They want to, who knows what they want. There's lots of things that they want. It may be that our government doesn't like it, but there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to listen to that and to engage them in dialogue and say, look, there are other ways that you can do it besides the way you're doing it now. So labeling them terrorist is the worst thing that you can do, and it is essentially squashes or kills political dialogue. And I guess
I think your question highlights a really important doctrinal issue, which is, there is no universal definition of terrorism, and there's numerous definitions within U.S. law. The immigration code, the criminal code, there isn't one consistent definition, which I think ultimately gives the government even more discretion in how it wants to apply or enforce counterterrorism. And generally, the common, I guess, the main principles of terrorism, and others can supplement what I think the main elements of a terrorist act are, is usually it's violence that's conducted to coercively influence government policy or government action, or to create fear among civilians with a political objective. That tends to be kind of the elements that people will cite to the difference between a terrorist act versus somebody is killed for money, or somebody's killed for drugs, or somebody's robbed because they want to steal your television. I just wanted to highlight that without an opinion either way from my end. But I think the point that I want to make is that it is it's a very broad definition. The government has a lot of discretion to use it how it pleases, and there's almost two definitions of terrorism. That's where I brought up the racial subtext, is that when you're a Muslim accused of terrorist, it's very different. If you notice, Joseph Stack, who was the white American who was an anti-tax advocate, who flew an airplane into an IRS building. That is a very political statement, and he left a note, a suicide note, and he killed a federal veteran and a federal employee, and had the plane hit the building any other than lunchtime on Friday, there could have been at least 100 people that could have died, federal employees. But the government did not categorize it as a terrorist act. And I think that's where it gets highly problematic, and it does show that it's certainly a politicized concept and a politicized law enforcement tool. And I think that's where we at least need to call our government to task and say, if you're going to use terrorism and prosecute it, it really shouldn't be based on the religious or racial background of the defendant, and that shouldn't be the determinant of whether something is just a garden variety criminal act